Homelander didn't stop when the crowd started running. He kept talking to cameras that had already hit the pavement, smiling through clenched teeth as heat vision flashed in short, uncontrolled bursts that stitched fire across cars and storefronts. A protester screamed. Someone tried to film. The phone melted in their hands before it touched the ground. Police sirens cut off mid-wail as vehicles flipped and skidded through smoke. High above the street, Beerus sat cross-legged on the edge of a skyscraper, chin resting on his fist, watching with mild curiosity. Wise hovered beside him, studying the scene like a lesson unfolding in real time. Homelander laughed, then shouted, then raged at people who were no longer listening. His cape dragged through flames as he paced in widening circles, demanding obedience from a city that had already decided to run. Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. Not because of the destruction, but because the noise was becoming irritating. And far below, Homelander finally looked up and realized someone was watching him. This was not the outburst. This was the moment everything began to go wrong. You're about to see how a god reacts when a false one unravels in public. Subscribe once, because what follows isn't a battle. It's a slow, irreversible decision you won't understand until it's too late. Homelander stood in the middle of the intersection like a man trying to finish a speech no one was listening to anymore. Cars burned around him, their alarms dying one by one as heat warped their electronics. Smoke climbed into the sky in thick, uneven columns while civilians sprinted in every direction without looking back. He kept talking anyway. His voice cracked between forced smiles and sudden bursts of anger, swinging from reassurance to accusation in the span of seconds. He pointed at empty sidewalks, demanding loyalty from people who had already decided that distance was safer than devotion. High above, on the edge of a glass tower overlooking the chaos, Beerus watched with one leg crossed over the other. His chin rested lazily against his fist as if this were mild entertainment instead of a city block unraveling. Wise hovered beside him, eyes calm, posture relaxed. Emotional instability amplified by power, Wise observed softly. Fascinating combination. Beerus didn't respond. His eyes followed Homelander's movements with detached interest. Below, a police helicopter tried to circle the area, spotlight cutting through smoke as officers shouted through loudspeakers for Homelander to stand down. The beam passed over him twice, and on the third pass, Homelander snapped. His eyes flashed red. The helicopter split in half midair before the crew could react. Metal and flame rained down into the street in a deafening crash that echoed between buildings. Civilians screamed louder than before. The situation stopped being a meltdown and became a disaster. Beerus' ears twitched slightly. Not at the destruction. At the noise. Homelander turned slowly in a circle, chest heaving, cape dragging through ash. "You wanted to see me," he shouted at no one. "Here I am." He fired another uncontrolled burst of heat vision into a row of parked cars, not aiming at anything, just releasing pressure he didn't know how to contain. Explosions rippled down the street like firecrackers. Wise tilted his head. He is not attacking an enemy, he is arguing with his own expectations. Beerus' eyes narrowed a fraction. Why do they let this continue? Wise glanced toward the distant edges of the city where sirens gathered in clusters. Because they built their safety around him. Stopping him means admitting they never controlled him. On the street, a group of civilians tried to move an injured man from beneath a flipped vehicle. Homelander noticed the movement and froze. For half a second, something like guilt crossed his face. Then his expression hardened. "Don't run," he shouted. "I'm protecting you." He took a step toward them. They screamed and scattered, leaving the injured man behind. That was when Homelander finally looked up. Not because he sensed power. Because he felt watched. His eyes locked onto the distant rooftop where Beerus sat calmly against the skyline. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire below crackled loudly in the silence between them. Homelander squinted. "Who the hell are you?" Beerus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lack of reaction irritated Homelander more than any insult could have. He rose slowly into the air, hovering above the smoke, eyes fixed on the small purple figure watching him from above. Wise smiled faintly. "He has noticed." Beerus remained still. Homelander shot upward, closing the distance in seconds, landing hard on the rooftop with enough force to spiderweb the concrete beneath his boots. He stood tall, trying to reclaim the presence he had just lost on the street below. "You think this is funny?" Homelander demanded. Beerus looked at him, the way someone might look at a loud animal in a quiet room. "I am observing," Beerus said calmly. Homelander blinked, thrown off by the tone. "Observing what?" Beerus' eyes drifted briefly toward the burning street below, then back to Homelander. How long they allowed this? The words didn't make sense to Homelander, but the lack of fear in them did. He stepped closer, jaw tightening. "You don't know who you're talking to." Wise floated up to the rooftop beside Beerus. "He genuinely believes that," Wise said quietly. Homelander's eyes flashed red again. "I asked you a question." He fired his heat vision point-blank at Beerus' chest. The beam hit and vanished. No impact, no sound. The light simply disappeared as if swallowed by the air itself. Homelander's eyes widened in disbelief as he pushed harder, pouring more power into the beam until his face strained. Beerus tilted his head slightly. "That tickles less than the noise you were making," he said. Homelander stopped firing, breathing hard. For the first time, confusion overpowered anger. Beerus uncrossed his legs and stood. The movement was slow, casual, almost lazy. Homelander instinctively took half a step back without realizing it. Beerus walked past him to the edge of the rooftop and looked down at the burning street. Fire trucks were arriving now. People were still running. Sirens layered over each other in a chaotic chorus. "You are loud," Beerus said without turning around. Homelander clenched his fists. "You don't get to talk to me like that." Beerus glanced over his shoulder. "I just did." Homelander lunged forward, fist swinging with enough force to shatter buildings. Beerus shifted half an inch to the side. The punch missed completely, and Homelander's fist smashed into the rooftop, sending chunks of concrete flying into the air. Before Homelander could recover, Beerus tapped him lightly on the forehead with one finger. The sound was small. The effect was not. Homelander's body shot backward across the rooftop, tearing through air conditioning units and slamming into a water tower that exploded into a cascade of metal and water. He lay there for a second, stunned, staring up at the sky. Beerus didn't pursue him. He simply sat back down at the edge of the building. Wise smiled. "You interacted sooner than expected." Beerus looked mildly annoyed. He was becoming disruptive. Below, emergency responders watched in shock as Homelander crashed through the rooftop and disappeared from sight. News helicopters zoomed in, capturing every second live. Across the city, people began to realize something impossible. Homelander had just been hit, and the one who hit him looked bored doing it. Homelander did not stay down for long. He tore himself out of the twisted remains of the water tower with a snarl, soaked in rusted water and humiliation. The rooftop around him was cratered, bent inward where his body had landed, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. He looked back toward the edge of the building. Beerus was sitting exactly where he had been before, legs crossed again, gaze drifting lazily over the burning street as if Homelander no longer required attention. That hurt more than the hit. News helicopters circled closer now, cameras zoomed tight on the rooftop. Millions of people were watching live as Homelander, the untouchable symbol of Vought, struggled to regain his posture in front of a stranger who hadn't even stood up to fight him. Homelander's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Look at me," he shouted. Beerus didn't. Wise hovered slightly above the ledge, eyes calm. "He is used to escalation forcing engagement," Wise said softly. "He does not know what to do with indifference." Homelander's eyes began to glow again, not from strategy, but from emotion spilling over. He fired heat vision wildly across the rooftop, carving glowing trenches through concrete, sending debris raining down the sides of the building into the street below. People screamed as chunks of stone crashed into cars and sidewalks. Beerus' ears twitched again. This time he looked irritated. "You see," Wise said, "he equates attention with control." Beerus stood slowly. Homelander stopped firing, watching carefully now. This was what he wanted, a reaction, a sign that he mattered enough to demand effort. Beerus walked toward him at a calm pace, stepping over shattered debris without hurry. "You are worsening the noise," Beerus said. Homelander laughed nervously. "Good, maybe now you'll take me seriously." Beerus stopped a few feet away. "I was hoping you would stop." That sentence landed harder than any insult. Homelander snapped. He lunged again, faster this time, tackling Beerus and driving him straight through the side of the skyscraper. Glass exploded outward in a glittering storm as the two of them tore into the building's interior. Offices were shredded. Walls collapsed. Desks and computers flew in every direction as Homelander pushed forward with everything he had, screaming through clenched teeth as he forced Beerus backward through room after room. Beerus did not resist. He simply allowed the movement, sliding through walls like an object being carried by a tantrum rather than a fight. They burst out the opposite side of the building in a shower of debris and crashed into the street below with a thunderous impact that shook nearby storefronts. Civilians ran in every direction again, as dust and glass filled the air. Homelander stood up from the crater, panting, eyes wild. He looked down. Beerus was still on his feet. Unmoved, unharmed, unimpressed. The realization finally began to settle into Homelander's face. This wasn't working. Beerus dusted a piece of glass off his shoulder and looked around at the destruction now spreading across multiple blocks. Fire had jumped buildings. Sirens overlapped into a continuous wail. "This is excessive," Beerus muttered. Wise floated down beside them, observing calmly. "He is escalating because he believes scale equals dominance." Homelander clenched his fists so hard the air around them cracked. "Why aren't you fighting me?" Beerus looked at him with visible annoyance now. "Because you are fighting yourself." Homelander screamed and launched into the air again, grabbing Beerus by the arm and dragging him upward into the sky at supersonic speed. They punched through clouds, rising high above the city where the noise below became distant. Homelander stopped in midair and hurled Beerus downward like a missile. Beerus hit the street below feet first without bending his knees. The asphalt shattered outward in a perfect circle, but Beerus remained standing calmly in the center of it. Homelander descended after him, landing hard again, face twisted in frustration. "Do something." Beerus looked at him. "I am." That answer confused Homelander more than anything else had. Around them, phones recorded from every angle. News drones hovered at safe distances. Social media feeds exploded with disbelief as people watched their hero fail to make a dent in someone who barely acknowledged him. And that was when the second outburst truly began. Homelander turned away from Beerus. He faced the street. And he fired. A continuous beam of heat vision ripped down the road, splitting asphalt and vehicles alike as he carved a glowing trench through everything in front of him. Storefronts ignited. A bus exploded. The beam swept sideways, catching a line of parked cars in a chain reaction of fire. Beerus' expression hardened. Not because of the destruction, because of the choice. Wise's voice was calm but quieter now. He is no longer trying to prove himself to you. He is punishing the world for watching. Beerus took one step forward. Homelander turned back, eyes blazing, grin twisted into something unstable. You wanted to watch. Watch this. Beerus raised one hand. The beam stopped. Not blocked, not deflected. Stopped. Frozen in midair like a solid rod of light, stretching from Homelander's eyes to the burning street. Homelander's grin vanished as he realized he could not turn his head. He could not stop firing. The beam was locked in place by something he couldn't feel but couldn't overcome. Beerus flicked his finger. The beam bent upward into the sky and vanished harmlessly into the clouds. Silence fell between them. Beerus stepped closer, eyes half-lidded with irritation. You are not dangerous, he said. You are loud. Homelander's breathing slowed, not from calm, but from confusion beginning to overpower rage. For the first time he looked small, and the entire world watching realized something at the same time. Homelander wasn't losing a fight. He was unraveling in front of someone who refused to take him seriously. Inside Vought Tower, no one was speaking loudly anymore. The command room was filled with executives, analysts, and security personnel staring at a wall of live feeds, showing Homelander's breakdown from every possible angle. Cameras from news drones, traffic lights, civilian phones, and Vaught's own surveillance network all told the same story. Homelander wasn't winning. He wasn't even being opposed. He was being observed. Ashley Barrett paced back and forth in front of the screens, hands tangled in her hair. Why isn't he stopping? Why is he still? Stan Edgar cut her off without raising his voice, because he doesn't know how. Ashley turned toward him, eyes wide. Then tell him to stand down. Edgar shook his head slowly. That's not the problem. On the screens, Beerus stood calmly in the street as Homelander circled him like an animal trying to intimidate something that refused to react. Fires still burned in the distance. Emergency crews kept their distance, unsure whether approaching would make things worse. Edgar watched carefully. The problem, he said quietly, is that someone is seeing Homelander exactly as he is. Ashley looked at him, confused. What does that mean? It means, Edgar replied, the illusion is gone. Back on the street, Homelander paced in widening circles, chest rising and falling as he tried to force himself back into control. People were still watching from windows, rooftops, behind police barricades. Cameras were everywhere. And Beerus remained in the center of it all, unmoved. Wise floated a short distance away, studying Homelander with academic interest. He is aware of the audience now, Wise said. That makes this worse for him. Beerus' gaze didn't leave Homelander. Why do they still watch? Because they are trying to understand what they missed, Wise answered. Homelander suddenly turned toward a news drone hovering nearby and shot it out of the sky with a furious burst of heat vision. The wreckage fell into the street with a metallic crash. He looked around, searching for more cameras, more eyes. They're filming me, he muttered to himself. They think this is funny. Beerus tilted his head slightly. He thinks this is about humiliation. Wise smiled faintly. He cannot imagine another reason. In Vought Tower, Edgar leaned closer to the screen as Homelander began shouting again, not at Beerus this time, but at the air, at the city, at the invisible presence of judgment he couldn't escape. Ashley's voice trembled. We have to do something. Edgar shook his head again. No, we need to watch. She stared at him. Watch what? He's destroying the city. Edgar's eyes stayed on the screen. No, he's destroying himself. Across the city, Billy Butcher stood on a rooftop with Huey and Mother's Milk, watching through binoculars. Smoke drifted between buildings as Homelander's voice echoed faintly through the streets below. Huey lowered his phone. He's losing it. Butcher nodded slowly. He's always been like this. Mother's Milk frowned. Then why now? Butcher looked toward the small purple figure standing in the center of the chaos. Because now someone's calling his bluff without saying a word. Back on the street, Homelander finally stopped packing. He looked directly at Beerus, eyes no longer burning with rage, but with something closer to desperation. Say something, he demanded. You've been watching me this whole time, say something. Beerus sighed softly. You were calmer when no one questioned you, Beerus said. Homelander blinked. What? You only lose control when you feel seen, Beerus continued. That sentence hit harder than any physical blow. Homelander's jaw tightened. I'm in control. Beerus glanced around at the burning buildings, the shattered streets, the wreckage. You are not. The words echoed between them in the sudden quiet. Wise looked toward the skyline. They are mobilizing, he said. In the distance, military helicopters and armored vehicles were forming perimeters. Vought security teams were moving into position, unsure whether to approach or stay back. No one knew what the correct response to this situation was anymore. Homelander noticed the movement too. His eyes flicked toward the approaching forces. They think they can stop me, he muttered. Beerus watched him carefully now. He is about to escalate again. Wise nodded. Yes, but not toward you. Homelander rose into the air suddenly, hovering above the street. He turned toward the incoming vehicles, fists clenched, breathing uneven. Watch this, he said to Beerus. And for the first time, Beerus' expression shifted from curiosity to mild irritation. Because Homelander wasn't trying to prove himself to Beerus anymore. He was trying to prove himself to the world. And that made what came next far more dangerous than anything before. Homelander didn't look at Beerus when he moved. He looked at the approaching line of armored vehicles turning the corner 2 blocks away, lights flashing, loudspeakers blaring instructions no one expected him to follow. Soldiers poured out behind reinforced doors, weapons raised more out of protocol than belief. To Homelander, they weren't a threat. They were an audience. He shot forward in a blur and landed directly in front of the convoy, boots cracking the asphalt. The first vehicle barely had time to stop before he grabbed its front bumper and flipped it onto its side like a toy. Metal screamed as it skidded across the road and smashed into a storefront. Beerus watched without moving. Wise's voice was calm. He is performing now. Homelander turned toward the soldiers, eyes glowing. You wanted to see what I can do. The first wave of gunfire rattled through the air, bullets striking his chest and falling harmlessly to the ground. He smiled wide, arms stretched slightly as if inviting more. Then his heat vision flashed in a wide arc. 3 vehicles exploded in a chain reaction. The shockwave shattered windows for half a block. Civilians who had thought they were far enough away began running again as debris rained across the street. Fire climbed the sides of buildings like living things. Beerus' tail flicked once against the concrete. This is unnecessary, he muttered. Wise watched Homelander carefully. He is trying to reclaim the feeling of being feared. Homelander lifted one of the damaged vehicles and hurled it down the street. It bounced twice, crushing parked cars before slamming into a bus stop where people had taken shelter moments earlier. The structure collapsed in a cloud of dust and sparks. Sirens multiplied in the distance. Above them, news helicopters kept their distance but continued filming. The world watched as the situation spiraled beyond anything they had seen before. This was no longer a loss of control. This was a display. Back in Vought Tower, Ashley gripped the edge of a table, knuckles white. We have to call him off. We have to. Stan Edgar didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed on the screen showing Beerus still standing calmly in the center of the street. He's not doing this because of the military, Edgar said quietly. Ashley looked at him, then why? Because he feels judged, Edgar replied. On a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly. Huey stared at the destruction below in disbelief. He's going to kill a lot of people, Huey said. Butcher nodded once. Yeah. Mother's Milk shook his head, and that thing is still just watching. Butcher glanced toward Beerus. Not for long. Back on the street, Homelander rose into the air again and scanned the area, looking for movement, for reactions, for fear. He spotted a group of civilians trying to escape through an alley and descended in front of them, blocking their path. "Where are you going?" he asked, smiling too wide. They froze. Beerus' eyes narrowed. Homelander leaned closer to them. "I'm protecting you." One of them screamed and tried to run past him. Homelander grabbed the man by the collar and lifted him off the ground. "You don't run from me." The man kicked helplessly in the air. Beerus took a step forward. Wise glanced at him. "You have been patient." Beerus' voice was flat. "He is becoming irritating." Homelander threw the man aside into a pile of trash bags and turned back toward the street, searching for the next reaction, the next place to assert control. He didn't notice Beerus approaching behind him. Beerus stopped a few feet away. "Enough," he said calmly. Homelander turned, startled by how close Beerus suddenly was. "Stay out of this." Beerus looked around at the burning buildings, the crushed vehicles, the terrified civilians hiding behind anything that could provide cover. "This is what you do when you feel ignored?" Beerus asked. Homelander's eyes flared. "They need to remember who I am." Beerus sighed softly. "They remember," he said. "That is the problem." Homelander charged again, fist swinging toward Beerus' face with everything he had left. Beerus didn't move. He simply raised 2 fingers and tapped Homelander's wrist mid-swing. The arm stopped. Not slowed. Stopped completely in midair. Homelander strained, muscles trembling as he tried to push through the invisible resistance. His expression shifted from rage to confusion to something dangerously close to panic. Beerus looked at him without emotion. "You are not strong enough to behave this loudly." With a gentle twist of his fingers, Beerus redirected Homelander's momentum sideways and sent him crashing into the side of a building. Concrete exploded outward as Homelander disappeared into a cloud of dust and debris. Silence followed. The soldiers, civilians, and emergency crews all froze at once, staring at the small figure now standing calmly in the middle of the ruined street. For the first time, the city realized something new. Homelander wasn't the biggest problem here. He was the one being corrected. The soldiers did not understand what they were looking at. From their perspective, Homelander had just been thrown through a building by something small, calm, and completely unknown. Training took over where understanding failed. Commanders shouted orders. Weapons were raised again, not at Homelander this time, but at Beerus. Laser sights dotted his chest. Beerus didn't look at them. Wise watched with mild curiosity. They are attempting to correct the wrong problem. A commanding officer shouted through a megaphone, voice shaking despite the effort to sound firm. "Step away from the individual, hands where we can see them." Beerus glanced sideways at Wise. "They think I am helping him." Before Wise could reply, the first shot rang out. Then dozens more followed. Gunfire filled the street in a deafening wave as bullets tore through the air toward Beerus. Civilians ducked behind wreckage. Emergency crews dropped flat to the ground. The soldiers committed fully to the only response they knew. The bullets stopped 3 feet away from Beerus. They hung there, suspended in midair like metallic raindrops frozen in time. The gunfire slowed, then ceased entirely as soldiers stared in disbelief at the impossible sight in front of them. Beerus finally turned his head. "This," he said softly, "is why he thinks he is important." Wise nodded. Yes, they mistake power for control. Beerus flicked his finger. Every bullet fell straight to the ground at once with a soft clatter that echoed louder than the gunfire had. The sound carried across the ruined street in a strange, hollow rhythm. The soldiers hesitated, and that hesitation turned into a mistake. A missile launcher from one of the armored vehicles fired before anyone could stop it. The projectile screamed through the air toward Beerus, trailing smoke and fire. Someone had panicked. Someone had escalated without waiting for orders. The missile hit. A violent explosion swallowed the center of the street in fire and dust. Shockwaves rippled outward, shattering what little glass remained in nearby buildings. The blast knocked soldiers off their feet and sent debris skidding across the pavement. Smoke filled everything. For a moment, no one could see. Then the smoke began to clear. Beerus was still standing in the same spot. Not burned, not moved, not even annoyed enough to change his posture. But his eyes were different now. Not curious. Irritated. Wise expression softened slightly. That was unwise. Beerus looked toward the soldiers slowly. They are louder than he is. The temperature in the air seemed to drop. Soldiers scrambled to reload, but their hands shook now. Radios filled with overlapping voices demanding updates that no one could provide. They had just used heavy ordnance on something that did not react to it at all. Behind Beerus, Homelander pulled himself out of the collapsed building, covered in dust and rubble. He looked toward the smoke, then toward the soldiers, then back at Beerus. For a brief moment, something like relief crossed his face. They were attacking someone else now. He wasn't the center of it. Beerus noticed. That is the problem, he muttered. Wise tilted his head. You are losing patience. Beerus raised his hand slightly. Every weapon in the soldiers' hands bent inward at once. Rifles twisted like soft metal under invisible pressure. Missile launchers folded in half. The armored vehicles groaned as their turrets warped and collapsed. No explosion. No violence. Just quiet removal. The soldiers stumbled backward, staring at useless equipment in disbelief. Beerus lowered his hand. You are finished, he said calmly. Not to Homelander. To them. Homelander watched this unfold with wide eyes. He had never seen power used this way. No shouting, no spectacle, just effortless correction. And for the first time since this started, he didn't feel angry. He felt small. Across the city, people watching the live broadcasts realized something terrifying. The military had tried to intervene, and the result had not been a battle. It had been a demonstration. Back in Vought Tower, Stan Edgar leaned back slightly in his chair. That's it, he said quietly. Ashley looked at him. What do you mean? He's done watching, Edgar replied. On the street, Beerus turned back toward Homelander. The fires still burned, the air still smelled of smoke and metal, but the noise was gone. The sirens had stopped. The gunfire had ended. Even the helicopters kept their distance now. For the first time since this began, there was quiet. Beerus took a step toward Homelander. And Homelander did not step forward to meet him. Homelander did not rush Beerus this time. He stood in the middle of the ruined street, dust drifting off his cape, breathing slowly as if trying to hold himself together by force. The fires crackled around them, but the city had gone strangely quiet, like everyone was waiting to see what he would do next. For the first time, Homelander had no idea. Beerus walked toward him without hurry, stepping over twisted metal and shattered concrete, as if the destruction were an inconvenience rather than a battlefield. Wise floated behind him, watching Homelander with the same interest a teacher might have for a student about to learn something unpleasant. You are calmer now, Beerus said. Homelander swallowed. I don't know what you are. Beerus stopped a few feet away. That is not important. Homelander's eyes flicked around the street. Cameras still hovered at a distance. People were still watching from windows and rooftops. The entire world was still looking at him. But now they weren't looking with fear. They were looking with confusion. And that frightened him more than anything Beerus had done. "You think you're better than me," Homelander said quietly. Beerus shook his head once. "I'm not thinking about you at all." That sentence landed like a physical blow. Homelander's jaw tightened. "Everything happening here is because of me." Beerus glanced around at the wreckage, then back at Homelander. "No, this is happening because of them." He gestured lazily toward the skyline where Vought Tower stood in the distance. Homelander frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Wise spoke gently. "You were given power without guidance, praise without restraint, and fear without consequence. This is the result." Homelander looked between them, struggling to process words that didn't feel like threats or insults, but something worse. "Explanations." "I protect people," Homelander snapped. Beerus tilted his head. "You demand they feel safe around you." "That's the same thing." Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. "No." Silence settled between them again. Across the city, Billy Butcher watched through binoculars from a rooftop. Huey stood beside him, barely blinking. "He's not fighting him," Huey said. Butcher nodded slowly. "No, he's breaking him." Back on the street, Homelander took a step backward without realizing it. "You don't understand this world," he said. Beerus replied calmly, "I understand it very well." Homelander's eyes flared faintly, but he didn't attack. Something in him had begun to recognize that attacking wasn't solving anything. It wasn't forcing Beerus to react the way everyone else always had. Beerus wasn't scared. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't even angry. He was just done watching. "You are not the center of what is happening," Beerus said. Homelander shook his head. "That's not true." Beerus glanced toward the twisted remains of military vehicles, the burning storefronts, the empty streets where people had fled. "You think this is about you because you cannot imagine anything else." Homelander's breathing grew uneven again, but not from rage this time. From something like realization creeping in. Wise watched carefully. He is starting to see the edges of the problem. Homelander looked at the destruction around him. Then at the soldiers in the distance, who were no longer pointing weapons at him. Then at the civilians who were watching from cover instead of running. And finally back at Beerus. "They're not afraid of me anymore," he said quietly. Beerus nodded once. "They are afraid of what you might do when you feel ignored." That truth settled into Homelander's expression in a way nothing else had. For years, fear had been his currency. Control had come from people believing he could snap at any moment. Now, that snapping had happened, and the illusion that it was for their protection had disappeared. He wasn't a guardian anymore. He was a problem. Beerus turned slightly, looking down the ruined street as if deciding whether to stay or leave. "I have seen enough," he said. Homelander's head snapped up. "Seen enough of what?" Beerus glanced back at him. "You." That was when Homelander realized something that terrified him. This entire time, he had been trying to make Beerus react. But Beerus had only been trying to decide whether Homelander was worth correcting. And now that decision had been made. Billy Butcher lowered the binoculars slowly, not because the view had become unclear, but because he no longer needed the magnification. What was happening on that street was obvious now, even from a distance. This wasn't a fight winding down. It was a decision settling into place. Huey looked at him nervously. "He's just standing there. Why isn't he doing anything?" Butcher kept his eyes on Beerus, because he already did. Mother's Milk frowned. "Did what?" Butcher exhaled through his nose. He figured out what Homelander really is. Back on the street, Homelander stood motionless as Beerus began to walk past him. There was no urgency in the movement, no aggression, just a quiet shift that made it clear the moment of observation had ended. Homelander turned quickly. "Where are you going?" Beerus didn't stop. "You are no longer interesting." Those words hit harder than anything else had. Homelander's face twisted. "You don't get to just walk away from me." Wise floated gently behind Beerus. He still believes attention equals importance. Homelander followed them, boots crunching through broken glass. "You think you've won something. You think you understand me." Beerus paused and looked at him over his shoulder. "I understand that you were allowed to grow without limits." Homelander clenched his fists. "I'm the strongest person on this planet." Beerus replied calmly, "That is not a compliment." The air between them felt heavier now, not from power, but from something shifting in Homelander's mind. For the first time, he wasn't trying to intimidate Beerus. He was trying to keep him from leaving. Across the city, news feeds replayed the confrontation from multiple angles. Analysts speculated wildly. Commentators tried to frame what they were seeing into narratives they understood, but the footage didn't fit any of them. Homelander wasn't losing. He was being dismissed. In Vought Tower, Stan Edgar watched silently as Beerus turned his back on Homelander. Ashley stood nearby, whispering frantic questions to anyone who would answer. Edgar spoke quietly. "This is the worst possible outcome." Ashley looked at him. "Why?" "Because Homelander doesn't know how to exist without being the center," Edgar replied. Back on the street, Homelander stepped in front of Beerus, blocking his path. "You're not done with me." Beerus' expression did not change. "Yes, I am." Homelander's breathing grew faster. "You can't just decide that." Beerus tilted his head slightly. "I just did." That was when the panic returned to Homelander's eyes, but it wasn't the loud, explosive panic from before. It was quiet, internal, desperate. The kind that comes when someone realizes the rules they depended on never actually existed. He looked around at the ruined street, at the soldiers keeping their distance, at the civilians watching from cover. No one was waiting for him to fix this. No one was cheering. No one was calling him a hero. They were watching Beerus. Butcher saw it from the rooftop and nodded slowly. "There it is." Huey squinted. "What?" "He's not the main character anymore," Butcher said. Homelander turned in a slow circle, noticing the same thing. Every phone, every camera, every eye was fixed on the small purple figure walking calmly through the wreckage. "Not him." "Beerus." Homelander's voice trembled slightly. "They're looking at you." Beerus replied, "They were always looking at you. That was the problem." Wise smiled faintly. He is experiencing perspective for the first time. Homelander stepped backward again, something inside him finally cracking in a way that heat vision and fists never could. He wasn't angry now. He was lost. Beerus resumed walking. Homelander didn't follow. He just stood there in the middle of the destroyed street, watching the only being in this world who had refused to treat him like a god walk away without concern. And Billy Butcher, watching from a distance, realized exactly what was about to happen next. Because when someone like Homelander stops trying to prove himself, he starts trying to get noticed again. No matter the cost. Homelander did not shout when Beerus turned his back. He didn't threaten. He didn't fire heat vision. He didn't lunge forward. Instead, he stood perfectly still in the ruined street, eyes locked on the small figure walking away from him like he was nothing more than background noise. That stillness was more dangerous than his rage had been. Across the city, people watched the live feeds in silence. Commentators had stopped talking. Analysts had nothing useful to say. Everyone sensed the same thing without being able to explain it. This wasn't over. Homelander's jaw tightened slowly. He looked around at the wreckage, at the soldiers holding position, at the civilians peeking from behind cover. He noticed where their attention was pointed. Not at him. At Beerus. Something snapped inside him again, but this time it wasn't loud. It was cold and deliberate. "If you won't watch me," he muttered, "I'll make you." He rose into the air without warning and shot straight upward into the sky, disappearing above the smoke and clouds in seconds. Cameras struggled to track him. Helicopters swerved, trying to keep him in frame. Beerus did not look up. Wise did. He is going somewhere with purpose now. Beerus sighed softly. He wants to be followed. And he was. Every news drone and satellite adjusted to track Homelander's path as he flew across the city at supersonic speed. The world watched the red and blue blur streak across the skyline toward a familiar destination. Vought Tower. Inside the building, executives and security teams were still scrambling to recover from the earlier chaos. Ashley was on the phone with 3 different departments at once when the entire structure trembled violently. Homelander crashed through the upper floors like a missile, glass and steel exploding outward in every direction. He landed in the main lobby in a storm of debris, eyes glowing, cape dragging across polished marble. Employees screamed and scattered. Stan Edgar stepped out of an elevator, just in time to see Homelander, standing in the center of the lobby like a bomb about to go off. "What are you doing?" Edgar asked calmly. Homelander turned slowly toward him, fixing the problem. Back on the street, Wise glanced toward Vought Tower as distant explosions echoed through the air. "He has chosen the place that made him." Beerus nodded, "Yes." "And you are still not moving," Wise observed. Beerus' eyes remained half-lidded. "I want to see how far he goes." Inside Vought, Homelander grabbed a security guard by the collar and threw him aside without even looking at him. He walked toward the massive holographic displays of the 7, still glowing faintly in the lobby. He stared at his own image. Then he fired heat vision straight through it. The projection unit exploded into sparks and smoke as the image of himself flickered and died. Employees watched from stairwells and offices as Homelander began tearing through the building floor by floor. Offices were smashed. Server rooms were ripped apart. He wasn't searching for anyone. He was destroying the place that had taught the world to worship him. Edgar followed at a distance, watching with quiet understanding. "You're doing exactly what they always feared you would," Edgar said. Homelander didn't turn around. "No, I'm doing what they made me." Back outside, Billy Butcher saw the smoke rising from Vought Tower and shook his head slowly. "There it is." Huey stared at the skyline. "He's attacking Vought." Butcher nodded. "He's trying to prove he doesn't need them." Inside the tower, Homelander reached the executive floors. He walked into the command room and saw screens replaying footage of Beerus and the street confrontation from earlier. He froze. He walked closer to the screens, watching himself from an outside perspective for the first time. The rage, the screaming, the way Beerus barely reacted. His reflection in the black glass of the monitors looked unfamiliar to him. He turned toward Edgar. "They were watching me like I was the problem." Edgar nodded once, "Because you were." Homelander's eyes flared red again, but he didn't fire. He just stood there, shaking slightly. Back on the street, Beerus finally looked toward the tower. The building shuddered as another section collapsed inward from Homelander's destruction. Wise watched Beerus carefully. "You allowed this to continue longer than you intended." Beerus' expression hardened slightly. "Yes." "Are you finished observing?" Wise asked. Beerus took a single step forward. "Yes." Because Homelander had stopped trying to get Beerus' attention and started trying to force the world to look at him again. And that was louder than anything he had done before. The next tremor inside Vought Tower did not come from Homelander. It came from silence. Homelander had just ripped an entire wall of servers out of the executive floor when the building stopped echoing with his destruction. The alarms cut off mid-scream. The hum of emergency lights died. Even the distant crackle of fire seemed to mute itself. He looked up slowly. Beerus was standing in the doorway. Not flying, not crashing through the wall, just standing there as if he had always been part of the room. Wise hovered behind him, eyes calm, staff resting lightly in his hand. Homelander's chest rose and fell quickly. You came to watch again. Beerus stepped forward, glass crunching under his feet. No. Homelander frowned. Then why are you here? Beerus glanced around at the destroyed office, the shattered screens, the torn cables hanging from the ceiling. Because you are getting louder. Homelander laughed bitterly. You think this is loud. You haven't seen anything yet. Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. That is what concerns me. Outside the building, news helicopters circled at a distance, broadcasting live footage of smoke pouring from Vaught's upper floors. The world watched the tower burn while commentators struggled to explain why Homelander was attacking the place that made him famous. Billy Butcher watched from the rooftop, lowering his binoculars slowly. Now he moves, he muttered. Inside, Homelander took a step toward Beerus. You don't get to tell me when I'm done. Beerus looked at him with visible irritation. You do not understand. You have already been done for some time. Homelander's jaw tightened. I'm not broken. Beerus replied calmly. You were never stable. That sentence stopped Homelander in place. For the first time since this began, he didn't have a comeback. He didn't have a threat ready. He just stared at Beerus, trying to process words that cut deeper than physical force. Wise spoke gently. He was built to be admired, not corrected. Homelander turned toward Wise. Shut up. Beerus raised one finger slightly. Homelander's voice stopped mid-breath. Not choked, not silenced violently, simply removed as if the air refused to carry his sound. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. Beerus walked closer. You are not dangerous because you are strong, Beerus said quietly. You are dangerous because no one ever told you no. Homelander swung his fist instinctively, trying to hit Beerus through the frustration building inside him. Beerus caught the punch with 2 fingers. Not strained, not braced. God. Homelander pushed harder, muscles trembling, but Beerus' hand didn't move an inch. The difference in power wasn't dramatic, it was casual. Beerus tilted his head. You have never met resistance before. Homelander's eyes widened. Beerus flicked his wrist. Homelander's body flew backward through the office wall, tearing through concrete and steel before smashing into the opposite side of the floor in a cloud of dust. The entire building shook from the impact. Beerus walked through the hole in the wall calmly. Homelander tried to stand, but this time his movements were slower. Not from injury, but from the weight of something he couldn't understand settling into him. Beerus stopped a few feet away. I have watched you long enough, he said. Homelander finally managed to speak again as the pressure lifted from his throat. You think you can fix me? Beerus shook his head. No. That answer terrified Homelander more than anything else. Beerus raised his hand slightly and tapped Homelander's chest with 2 fingers. The effect was immediate. Homelander gasped as something inside him shifted. His strength didn't vanish. His powers didn't disappear. But the overwhelming, crushing certainty that he was untouchable broke. He could feel limits now. He could feel weight. He could feel himself. Beerus lowered his hand. You will still be strong, he said calmly, but you will know what you are. Homelander fell to his knees, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Outside, the fires continued to burn. Sirens wailed in the distance. But inside Vought Tower, something far more important had just happened. Homelander had not been defeated. He had been corrected, and the world watching understood the difference. Homelander did not stand up immediately. He stayed on his knees in the wreckage of Vaught's executive floor, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The dust from the collapsed walls drifted slowly through the air, catching in the emergency lights like quiet snowfall. Beerus had already stepped back. He wasn't watching Homelander closely anymore. He was observing the room, the broken screens, the exposed cables, the ruined architecture that had once projected power to the entire world. Wise hovered near the ceiling, eyes calm. "He is experiencing something unfamiliar," Wise said softly. "Perspective." Outside, news helicopters zoomed in as much as they dared. Cameras caught the image of Homelander kneeling in the wreckage, not fighting, not raging, not shouting. Just still. The silence was more shocking than the destruction had been. Across the city, people watched the feeds without speaking. Social media, usually filled with noise, slowed into hesitant speculation. The question was what Homelander would do next. It was what he couldn't do anymore. In Vought Tower's lobby, employees hid behind overturned desks, peeking toward the elevators that had stopped responding. No one knew what was happening upstairs, but they could feel that something had changed. The chaos had a different weight now. Stan Edgar watched from a lower floor, having evacuated the command room when Homelander began tearing through the building. He stood in a hallway with security staff, eyes fixed on a cracked tablet screen showing the live footage. "He's not attacking," Ashley whispered beside him. Edgar nodded slowly. "No, he's thinking." Back upstairs, Homelander finally tried to stand. He pushed himself up carefully, like someone testing whether the ground would hold. His legs didn't shake from injury, but from unfamiliar doubt. He looked at Beerus, who was now standing near the shattered windows, gazing out at the city. "You did something to me," Homelander said quietly. Beerus didn't turn around. "Yes." Homelander swallowed. "I feel different." Beerus replied, "You feel accurate." Those words settled into Homelander's expression like a slow realization he couldn't escape. He looked out the broken windows too, seeing the city spread beneath him, smoke rising from blocks he had burned only minutes ago. For the first time, he didn't feel powerful looking at it. He felt responsible. Wise floated closer. "You are noticing consequence for the first time." Homelander didn't argue. On a rooftop across the city, Billy Butcher watched the same footage with narrowed eyes. Huey stood beside him, barely blinking. "He's not shouting," Huey said. Butcher shook his head. "No, he's seeing himself." Mother's Milk looked uneasy. "That's worse, isn't it?" Butcher nodded slowly. "Yeah, for him it is." Inside the tower, Homelander walked slowly toward the edge of the broken floor. Glass crunched under his boots as he looked down at the street far below. Fire trucks were still spraying water. Soldiers were regrouping at a distance. Civilians were peeking out from buildings, phones raised again. But now they weren't filming him out of fear. They were filming him out of curiosity. He noticed. "They're still watching me," Homelander said quietly. Beerus finally turned to face him. "Yes." Homelander's eyes flicked toward him. "But it feels different." Beerus nodded once. "They are no longer pretending." That truth settled heavily into the room. Homelander realized that the fear he used to inspire had been mixed with belief. People had wanted to think he was a protector. Now, they were seeing him without that story. Just a man with power who had lost control. Wise watched carefully. "The illusion was removed without taking his strength," Wise said. Beerus' gaze remained steady. "That was the point." Homelander stepped back from the window slowly, looking at Beerus in a way that was no longer angry or desperate. It was confused, searching. "What happens now?" he asked. Beerus' expression didn't change. "You live with it." Outside, the world kept watching. not because they expected another explosion, but because they understood something important had shifted. Homelander was still powerful, still dangerous, but he was no longer untouchable. He was visible. And that visibility changed everything. The first thing that changed was the way people spoke. News anchors no longer used words like hero, savior, or protector when referring to Homelander. The language shifted subtly but decisively into terms like incident, instability, and liability. Panels of experts debated psychology instead of strategy. Military analysts stopped discussing countermeasures and started discussing containment. Homelander watched it happen from inside Vought Tower. He stood in the ruined executive floor, staring at a surviving monitor replaying footage of his own outburst from earlier. He saw himself screaming at empty streets, firing lasers at buildings, arguing with someone who barely reacted. He didn't recognize the person on the screen. Beerus stood quietly nearby, watching Homelander watch himself. Wise hovered behind him, expression thoughtful. "He is confronting the version of himself others always saw," Wise said softly. Beerus nodded once, yes. Downstairs, Vought employees were being escorted out of the building by security. No one spoke loudly. No one argued. The atmosphere felt like the evacuation of a fallen monument rather than an office complex. The illusion that Vought controlled anything had collapsed with the glass. Stan Edgar stepped into the street and looked up at the tower. He knew what this meant. Vought had built its empire on Homelander's image, and that image had just been stripped down to something ordinary, something flawed, something human. The company had lost more than a spokesperson. It had lost its foundation. On a rooftop across the city, Billy Butcher watched the live coverage with a strange quiet in his expression. Huey scrolled through social feeds, showing thousands of posts questioning Homelander for the first time. "They're turning on him," Huey said. Butcher nodded slowly. "No, they're waking up." Back inside the tower, Homelander turned away from the screen. "They don't believe in me anymore," he said. Beerus replied calmly, "They believe in what they see." Homelander looked at him, searching for something in his expression that wasn't there. "I can still do everything I could before." Beerus nodded, "Yes." "Then why does it feel like I can't?" Homelander asked. Beerus' voice remained even, "Because power without illusion is heavy." Homelander fell silent. Outside, government officials held emergency meetings. Military commanders reviewed footage of the confrontation and reached the same conclusion independently. Homelander was no longer an asset to be managed through public relations. He was a risk to be monitored. That shift in thinking happened quietly but permanently. Inside Vought Tower, Homelander walked slowly toward the shattered window again. He looked down at the city, not with dominance but with uncertainty. He could still fly. He could still burn through steel. He could still crush buildings. But now he knew people were watching him without believing in him. And that knowledge weighed more than any injury. Wise glanced at Beerus. "You did not remove his strength, you removed his story." Beerus' eyes stayed on Homelander. That was enough. Homelander finally turned back toward Beerus. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he asked. Beerus didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said after a moment. Homelander swallowed. "And then what happens to me?" Beerus' expression didn't change. "You exist." That simple answer carried more weight than anything else. Because for the first time, Homelander understood that he would have to live without the world pretending he was a god. He would have to be just a man with too much power, and no script telling him how to use it. Outside, the sun began to set behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the ruined streets and the broken tower. The world was still watching, but now the attention felt different. Quieter, more cautious, more honest. And that change was not temporary. It was permanent. Beerus did not leave immediately. He stood at the edge of the shattered floor as the last light of evening faded across the city, watching how humans behaved once the spectacle had ended. Fire crews worked methodically through the streets. Police set up quiet perimeters. News helicopters finally pulled back, their footage no longer frantic, but reflective. The world had shifted without anyone fully realizing it yet. Homelander stood several steps behind Beerus, no longer packing, no longer shouting. He watched the same city with a different expression now, one that carried uncertainty instead of ownership. "They're not afraid," Homelander said quietly. Beerus nodded once. "They are cautious." "That's worse," Homelander replied. Wise smiled faintly. "Fear is simple, caution requires thought." Below, people began walking the streets again in small groups, carefully stepping around debris and glass. They spoke in low voices, pointing at the tower, replaying the footage on their phones. They weren't celebrating. They weren't mourning. They were processing. In Vaught's lower floors, employees gathered their belongings under supervision, leaving behind offices that no longer felt powerful. The company's image had cracked in a way that marketing could never repair. Stan Edgar stood on the sidewalk, looking up at Homelander silhouetted in the broken window. For the first time, he didn't see an asset or a weapon. He saw a consequence. On a distant rooftop, Billy Butcher lit a cigarette and watched the skyline. Huey stood beside him, still staring at his phone where clips of Homelander kneeling in the rubble looped endlessly. "It's over," Huey said. Butcher shook his head slowly. "No, it's different." Inside the tower, Homelander stepped closer to Beerus. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Beerus didn't turn around. "That is not my concern." Homelander nodded faintly. He understood that now. Beerus hadn't come to save anyone, punish anyone, or fix the world. He had come because something had annoyed him long enough to act. And now that irritation was gone. Wise floated slightly higher, staff glowing softly. "You are satisfied?" he asked Beerus. Beerus looked out over the city one last time. "Yes." Homelander watched them carefully. "You're really leaving." Beerus glanced back at him. "You will be quieter now." It wasn't a threat, it was an observation. Homelander didn't argue. Beerus stepped forward and vanished without a sound. Wise followed a moment later, disappearing as gently as they had arrived. Homelander stood alone in the broken tower. Below, the city continued moving. He could still fly. He could still overpower anyone he wanted. But for the first time, he understood that people were watching him without believing in him, without needing him. He wasn't a god anymore. He was a man with power and no illusion to hide behind. Across the world, people went to sleep that night talking about what they had seen. Not about an alien being, not about a battle, but about the moment they realized Homelander had never been what they thought he was. That realization spread quietly, settling into conversations, news cycles, policies, and personal opinions. Vought would never recover its image. Homelander would never recover his. And humanity would never again mistake fear for faith so easily. Because once someone had watched Homelander without being impressed, everyone else learned how to do the same.